Thanks very much, Padmavajra. Very lovely introduction, and very interesting to see you in Sheffield. As Padmavajra told you, I lived with him in Padmavajra for many years, and I'm very glad that you've moved here. I think you've chosen very well to move to Sheffield, and I think it's very good as well that the Sheffield sangha have you. So make him work very hard. Yeah, so I'm really happy to be back in Sheffield again, and was last here in October, which seems a very long time ago. And of course, before that, I hadn't been here for a couple of years. And as Padmavajra says, I'm the president of the Sheffield Buddhist Centre, and I've been the president for quite a long time. I'm afraid I'm no good at time frame, so I can't actually remember when I started, but it's been many, many years that I've been the president. And I should just say that people sometimes ask, well, what is a president of a centre? Because every single centre in Triratna has a president. And I find it I don't actually like the word president. Mr. President or something like that. It doesn't have very good connotations for me for some reason or other. But it's as Padmavajra said, I see myself very much as a sort of a friend of the centre who is from another centre, if you like. Usually presidents are quite experienced order members who've been in the order a long time. And my becoming the president here came out of friendship. I was visiting here because of very, very strong connections with people here. And it was a very sort of natural thing to become, as it were, the special friend of the centre. And yes, I see that what I have to do when I come here is to really hopefully be a source of inspiration and encouragement and clarifying things for people, particularly for the people running the centre, but also to be available to anybody really who comes along to the centre, and to hear in a way how you're getting on, how you're finding the Dharma, how you're finding the centre. And I must say, for me, it's a privilege to come to the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. I love coming. I learn as much as I give. Yesterday, I was in the council meeting of the centre. Every centre has a board of trustees who kind of have an overview of what's going on in the centre. And it was an unusual meeting in that each individual member of the council was giving their sense of how they thought the centre was going and what they thought the important things were to attend to in the centre. And I was very, very impressed. I was very impressed indeed, because they were all, nobody shirked from sort of difficult questions, challenges, as well as pointing out the things they were inspired by. And it was very, very intelligent, very responsible, and considerable care, I would say, being given to what's going on in the centre. And I found that very inspiring. And as I say, educational. I live in a country retreat centre, and I've hardly been away from it over the last few years. So it was quite a learning, being with order members, running an urban retreat centre. But I haven't come to talk to you about how good the centre is, the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. I've been asked to speak on a very difficult subject, and perhaps that's why I'm taking my time getting into it. And I have been told I can only speak for 35 minutes, and I usually talk quite a long time anyway. So anyway, you're just going to have to put up with me, I'm afraid. But it is a very difficult subject, because I've got to talk about hell. Narak, as it's called in Sanskrit, and even modern Indian languages, Hindi, Marathi, Naraka. It's difficult. It's a difficult subject. In a way, I don't want to go there. I don't think anybody should want to go there, really, to talk about a subject like this. Down in the centre, in the hallway there, leading up this way, there's a big black and white drawing of the Wheel of Life. And the lowest segment is hell. And it really does look hellish. And there's another Wheel of Life depiction just as you turn the corner coming up here at reproduction of a Tibetan tanka. And what you see is in both of them, but particularly in the modern black and white one, this incredibly oppressive space, incredibly oppressive, really depicting, symbolizing states of extreme physical and mental suffering, overwhelming and oppressive and imprisoning and seemingly unending, and all the despair that goes with that. That's what we're talking about. And this is, of course, one of the realms in the Wheel of Life, which is the series that is going on at the moment in Sangha Night. The Wheel of Life being the Padmavajra Chapter, the Wheel of Becoming, this classic Buddhist depiction of the different sort of worlds of unenlightened life. In their own way, they're all states of different kinds of suffering, but hell is depicting the most extreme states of all. And I'm nervous about talking about that because, well, it's not something to take lightly. I think the first point I want to make is a very important one. Narak, hell in Buddhist tradition, is not a punishment from a vengeful God. This is extremely important when we approach this subject, that we understand that there's no creator God in Buddhist tradition. There's no first cause. There's no Lord of the universe in that way. There's no dispenser of eternal happiness and eternal punishment in Buddhist tradition. So don't be confused when you hear the word hell. This has got nothing to do with the theological accounts from theistic traditions. The traditional way of saying how hell comes about is that it's the result of our previous very unskillful actions. Very unskillful actions, especially, continuous, intense hatred, violence, killing, oppressing others. The result of behaving like that, living like that, it turns back on you into a state of terrible suffering. That's the way the way karma works in Buddhist tradition, and what these different realms are signifying in a way, that they're the sort of rebound, if you like, or the feedback that your actions in the past are returning to you. And hell especially comes about through indulgence in hatred and violence and killing and oppression and all the rest of it. I mean, you can sort of see it, I think, in sometimes in great drama, can't you? I think Shakespeare is sort of brilliant. Some of his characters, you see the progression from their lust for power and the way they oppress others, and how they end up paranoid, totally sort of paranoid, and in this hellish realm of sort of madness, of insanity. One thinks perhaps of King Lear especially. That's what we're talking about, and we know ourselves that, if we've indulged in hateful states or something like that, how we can end up becoming very, very suspicious of other people, very sort of paranoid and touchy and so on. Well, that gives us a bit of a taste of what hell might be like. There's even in hell, though, another kind of story going on. It also says in Buddhist tradition that the effect of unskillful actions eventually is that you start to burn with remorse. And that can be a hellish experience when you recognize that your behavior has taken you to that place of suffering. That can be, of course, a real turning point when you actually start to own and acknowledge what you've done. You'll see in the different depictions of the Wheel of Life, you have the Lord of the Dead, Yama, the Lord of Death. He will be showing you a mirror with your previous actions, shows you why you are there, which of course can be terribly frightening. You're there not arbitrarily, you're there because of your behavior, or sometimes he's depicted as sort of, weighing up on scales your skillful and unskillful actions. So there can be an element, we'll come back to this, a bit later, in knowing, in recognizing why you're there. And that, of course, is the turning point when you can really own that. It's very interesting talking about hell. One of Sangharakshita's teachers, Sangharakshita, the founder of our order, was a Tibetan Lama named Dada Rinpoche, a very great Lama, very compassionate man who ran a school for Tibetan refugees in Kalimpong in northeast India. And one of our order members went to see him, and he asked him a very interesting question. And he asked Rinpoche, do you believe in hell? In other words, do you believe that there is a place you go to called, or you could go to, called hell? And Dada Rinpoche was really puzzled. He said, well, of course, why else would you practice? Why else would you practice the Dharma? You practice the Dharma to avoid suffering in the future. And it was such, this order member, a friend of mine said, it was such a contrast with the way us moderns in the West come to the Dharma. We don't think like that, but this is very much a traditional perspective. You're vigilant in your Dharma practice so that you do not indulge and entertain states of mind and actions that will lead you to intense suffering. That's just intelligent. That's just intelligent. You're wakeful and alert to those things that are going to result in further suffering for yourself and others. So, I mean, one of the things I think, thinking about Rinpoche's words, one of the things that brings up for me is the dangers of complacency. The dangers of complacency. I mean, I think there's a lot of complacency. It's very easy to be complacent, I think, in this country, because in a way we're very protected. Perhaps not everybody would agree with that, but in many ways we are very, very protected. It's been very interesting, the effect of the pandemic. Suddenly our freedoms are curtailed and there's this threat of death. And of course, the recent invasion of Ukraine and the oppression of Ukraine is also making people realize that we cannot be complacent. And, that hell is sort of arriving, it's actually always been here, arriving on this earth. It's not sort of down below or in some other place. There are hell realms that we can see every day on the news, which can be very, very frightening. And of course, the difficulty with that sometimes is that we can be horrified, and even so horrified that we become inert and inactive and sort of passive to it. But what it should be doing is stimulating us to serious Dharma practice, particularly being very, very alert to not entertaining negative, unskillful states of mind, particularly resentments and hatreds and blame and so on. Really alert and vigilant to that. A very important point to mention in this, hell is not a permanent state in Buddhist tradition. You will read accounts in traditional texts where they say, well, you'll be in hell for incredibly long periods of time. We don't sort of go in for sort of describing that in our tradition, but they're trying to make a point to people to be careful. But there are no permanent states in the wheel of life. They're always going to change. They always can change. No matter how deep you fall, there is always, if you like, a possibility and a potential for redemption, for liberation. This is really important to understand. Sometimes we can get into states, I think, can't we, where we feel real despair. We just don't know how we're going to get out. Well, Buddhist tradition is really clear. Nothing is permanent. Nothing resists change. And with the right conditions, you can be liberated from that very difficult state. There's a great Buddhist teacher from the 8th century named Padmavajra, also known as Guru Rinpoche, an Indian Buddhist master with a lot of mythology and legendary material around him, but he's credited with the introduction of Buddhism into Tibet in the 8th century. Very, very inspiring, very, very rich tradition. And in one version of his life story, he is giving teachings before he leaves the Tibetans, before he goes away to communicate the Dharma to another place. And he's talking to somebody called Prince Laje, one of the princes, one of the sons of the Tibetan king, who invited Padmasambhava into Tibet. And Padmasambhava was giving a teaching on the sufferings that are inherent in the wheel of life. And it's quite strong stuff, you know, the Tibetans really go in for very, very strong communication of the starkness of the wheel of life, as well as the beauty and sublimity of enlightenment and the path to enlightenment and the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas and so on. But it's such a vivid communication that Prince Laje says the whole misery of the cycle we are passing through, please, Padmasambhava, please, Rinpoche, exert your compassion and cut it off. Just sweep it away. You know, it's almost as if he's said, well, you can do it. You're such a great teacher. You're such a great master. You can rid us of this misery that we're passing through, that we will pass through, this wheel of life. And Padmasambhava's response is really interesting. He says, how can you hope to embrace and to give rise to the bodhicitta? The bodhicitta is the urge of wisdom and compassion to liberate all life. Very, very important in Buddhist tradition to give rise to this bodhicitta. It's a sort of resolve and an impulse that we connect with to not just practice the Dharma for ourselves, but to enable others to practice it. There is great compassion there. He said, how can you hope to embrace the bodhicitta? Hell, miserable and useless, is most strange. Hell is the teacher of all the Buddhas. Wow, that's very mysterious, as if to say, no, I can't do that. You've got to change your attitude to all this suffering. You've got to change your attitude to it. You've got to see it as a teacher. You've got to see it as the teacher of all the Buddhas. And he goes on to describe the practice of the Buddha himself and also of the greatly compassionate Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, what they journeyed through in their spiritual life to liberate others in the Dharma. So I want to dwell on that a little bit this evening. Suffering is a teacher, or can be a teacher. You might have come across in your Buddhist reading the 4 noble truths. The first of which is the truth of dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness, or suffering. And sometimes when people see this, non-Buddhists see this, they think, well, Buddhism must be incredibly pessimistic, because it's saying the first noble truth, the first thing to look at is suffering. And then the second noble truth is its cause, which is craving or attachment. Then there is the end of suffering, nirvana, and then there's the 4th noble truth is the path to the liberation from suffering. But Buddhism is not being pessimistic. The Buddha isn't being pessimistic in identifying suffering as the first truth. It's not really a theological point. It's not a sort of point of doctrine. It's a pragmatic point that the Buddha is making. Suffering makes you really think. It makes you really think about your life. It makes you really wonder what it's for. It might be physical suffering, mental suffering. It might be bereavement. It might be one day looking at the state of the world and you think, there must be something different. Must be a different way to live than this. It might be that you're actually quite happy, but you just feel this tremendous longing for something else, something different, something higher. Whatever it might be, that waking up to unsatisfactoriness, to suffering, makes you look deeper into your life. So in that sense, hell, mysterious and strange, hell is the teacher of all the Buddhas. It can be a real beginning rather than a terrible failure, because it can sometimes feel like that when you hit a state of suffering, when a state of disappointment, a state of being let down, betrayed, or whatever it might be, even betrayed by your own body. Instead of it being that, it could be an occasion for a much deeper reflection and investigation into what your life is actually for. What is this really about? And you start to realize, well, actually, I need to reform myself. I need to get a hold of myself. I need to take responsibility for my life and not be passive in relation to this suffering. I need to change my consciousness so I start seeing this world and relating to other people in a different way. You know, it's very, very interesting, the whole COVID pandemic thing. You know, it seemed to have a very, very powerful effect on people. I hear there are many, many more people coming along to Buddhist centres since COVID broke out. Many, many more people coming along. I think people are realising, well, hang on, you can't just sort of coast on a comfortable human life. You know, when this kind of thing is happening, you've got to actually do something much, much more deeply with yourself and not be passive to what is happening. It's interesting, there's a Chinese Buddhist tradition which talks about different seeds in each of the realms, pure seeds, impure seeds, Buddha seeds. In other words, different potentialities. In hell, there are more sort of, how can you call it, sort of negative seeds than anywhere else, because it is a state of such extreme suffering. But there are also more Buddha seeds in that realm than anywhere else. In other words, there's greater potential in a state of suffering than anywhere else. Amazingly, it's an incredible thing to say. It's a source of great optimism, I think, that we could that insight is there in that Chinese Buddhist tradition. But of course, because it's saying no matter how low you sink, there is always the possibility of liberation. There is always the possibility of change. But of course, you need, as well as that, sometimes another dimension, breaking through, breaking in to support you, to help you, to encourage you in that state. So we need to find that. And we might also be called upon to give it. And I really want to concentrate on that. I want to talk more about how we might help people in hell. Because I think if we can understand how to help other people in hell, we've probably got a good idea of how we might help ourselves in hell. So I want to sort of turn it around more in what's called the Bodhisattva spirit, the Bodhisattva being the one who practices the Dharma life, the path to enlightenment for the benefit of all, and very concerned with the alleviation of suffering. I want to approach hell and suffering in that way, from that more altruistic perspective. So first of all, I think we ought to distinguish some different forms of suffering, just a few forms of suffering. And the first thing to mention, of course, and it's very important to just, to go to the obvious, hell is describing a state of extreme physical and mental suffering, states of illness, of disease, the effects of accident, and so on, but also mental states of depression, even insanity, madness, and so on. So that suffering is there, isn't it? We might have experienced it in one way or another ourselves, or in relation to other people going through that. So it's very, very important that we square up to that we acknowledge that in the world around us. I think that's the first thing we have to do. As well as these realms, in each realm there is a Buddha figure. And the Buddha figure is holding something. in relation to the beings in that state. These Buddha figures are said to be the emanations of the archetype, the transcendental archetype of absolutely overwhelming and incandescent compassion. The name for that is Avalokiteshvara, or Mahakarunika, the greatly compassionate one, this searing, blazing compassion. Very hard to describe it. Compassion perhaps isn't a very good word for it, because it's something so strong. Don't please, associate it with anything like pity or anything like that. So it's, what is the compassionate response to suffering, to hell? And in the hell realm, the Buddha figure, who is this great compassion, holds a vase, a beautiful vase, which has within it something called amrita. Amrita is nectar. It's called the nectar of immortality, or the nectar of the deathless. It's an incredibly soothing potion that alleviates all suffering. It goes back to, ancient Indian mythology. The pot of nectar of the deathless, of immortality, is, just can cure every ill imaginable. And really what this is saying, first of all, is that when you encounter the suffering of others, the first thing you have to do is to respond practically, to be that soothing balm, if you like, that alleviates that suffering. You don't, if somebody is sick, they're ill in whatever way, you don't give them a lecture on Buddhism. That's not the thing you do, first of all. I mean, you might if you're an incredibly compassionate bodhisattva and you see that's what people need to hear. But I mean, I tell you, it's really rough when you get Buddhists giving you a lecture on impermanence when you're really ill. And what you need is some direct help. I mean, when we were younger, we used to kind of pull these stunts on each other. So I think we're getting a bit wiser now. We're growing up slowly. No. You immediately respond with practical care, practical love and care that does everything it can to alleviate that suffering. And I'm sure those of you in the healing professions know what that's like. And those of you with children know what that's like as well. Immediately you have to do that. So that's the first thing. When you encounter people in hellish states of whatever kind, you are a healing balm, and sometimes you have to be that healing balm yourself. You have to be a presence, because you might have done all the practical things that you can, but it's not enough. It can't take that particular suffering and pain away, but you have to be with the person. You have to be with them. I should just say it's very, very important to understand. I said earlier on in my talk that hell is traditionally described as comes about through the effect of your past actions, but not all suffering is the effect of past actions. This is really important. If you're ill, it's not because you did something terrible to somebody in a previous life. You're ill because you have a body, and bodies get ill. That's the consequence of having a body. So it's very, very important to understand that. And our response, as I've said, is one of alleviating that suffering to the extent that you can, trying to have the immediate effect of soothing that person's illness. There's a wonderful story about the Buddha and his disciple Ananda coming across a monk who was lying in his own excrement. He had terrible dysentery, and he'd been neglected by the other monks terribly, sadly. The Buddha, as soon as he saw it, he and Ananda just cleaned him, lifted him onto the bed, cleaned him up before they did anything else. That immediate alleviation of suffering, and really trying to put that monk at ease before anything else. What he says to the monks later is another story, which you can follow up on if you like. It's also important, I think, to understand that I'm sure you all know this, that suffering can be a terribly lonely place. Terribly, terribly lonely place. And no one seems to understand you. You know, when you have physical illness, when you have mental illness of one kind or another, nobody seems to get it. Everybody else's life is going on, they're happy, they're carefree. And you feel, even though people are being kind, they're kind of not reaching you. They can't be you, can they? This is very, very poignant, I think. But we do need to understand that, I think, when we're with people who are suffering. You will have to be sometimes the one that can be a real company for somebody who's feeling that alienation from everybody else because they're suffering so much, either mentally or physically. You've got to be that loving presence yourself, able to sort of reach in. It might even be that you don't feel that that's happening. I remember sitting with my mother. She had dementia later on in her life, and I'd go to see her and spend, hours with her. And, I had to tell myself, she might not seem to be aware of you, but you still have to love, and you still have to be with her, and have faith, have confidence that something is transmitting, something is entering into the hell, and it was a hell that she was in. And it's amazing how sensitive people are. I had a very peculiar experience with my mother. I went to the care home she was in, and I was with my sister, and we had to have a meeting about her finances and how we could continue having her in care and all that sort of thing. And she was lying on her bed like this tiny little bird, just bones and skin and, barely kind of conscious. And we'd had our meeting, and I was sitting with my sister, and very helpfully a social worker came in to talk to us about, what we needed, what my mother needed. And when this person came in, and she was really, really helpful. As soon as she started speaking, my mother started to shake uncontrollably, and my mother was profoundly deaf as well. And I sort of slightly freaked out and went and got the nurse. And the nurse says, "Your mother knows that you're talking about her, and she's distressed," which was a real shock. So I just put my hand on her, and she immediately calmed down. But I thought, my goodness, something is being transmitted. Something is happening here. And I think we do need to have a much greater faith in, if you like, the power of consciousness, of mind, of heart, to communicate through pain, through illness, through even mental distress, to affect the other person, to be a balm for the other person, maybe even when they can't, apparently to us, they can't, they don't seem to be getting it. We're far more sensitive to one another than we realize, I think. In Buddhist tradition, consciousness is prime, it's primary, and it's powerful, and it transmits. So we might have to be that person for another person or other people. Be that person that's being that friend in their terrible isolation. And of course, the more we can do that for others, the more we can do that for ourselves. It might well be, we will be in the end, deeply, profoundly alone when it comes, when the time comes. Any of you have had, serious illness, and, I've had it a little bit myself. You are terribly alone, and you need to be able to turn to those dimensions, if you like, in yourself that you've generated through your meditation, through your spiritual practice. And one of the things I'm incredibly grateful to Sangha for, my teacher, and for my friends in the Sangha, that when I've been in times of difficulty, I've been able to turn to the Dharma as a kind of companion, something internalized within me that takes me through, great difficulty, even sort of hellish states. There are other kinds of suffering, other kinds of hells. There's one that is very pervasive, and we see it everywhere, and it's meaninglessness. That's a terrible hell, meaninglessness. There's a terrible nihilism and emptiness and materialism that surrounds us and that we can be caught up in, and a terrible cynicism and hedonism that can go with that, which is a hell. And it oppresses, and it's ghastly. It's absolutely ghastly, because it means that we're not allowed to be human. We're consumers, we're things, if you like, part of, the consumer society. And a consumer society means that human beings are not human beings anymore, they're consumers relating to other consumers. And you sort of feel that sometimes, again, with the media, the kind of manipulation of us as consumers. And if, with that kind of meaningless, you get these other ghastly attempts to find meaning, which are themselves manifestations of nihilism. I'm talking about various kinds of dogmatism and fanaticism in politics, in religion, in nationalism, in ideologies of various kinds, even sometimes people becoming fanatical and dogmatic, even in relation to causes which might be quite good, which could themselves be quite positive, but they're taken up with such a sort of dogmatism and a sort of self-righteousness that it becomes oppressive to other people. This is all the product of a meaningless existence. It's a desperate attempt to find meaning, and it creates hell. It creates something really hellish. It particularly creates the hell of conflict, conflict between people. And really, I think Buddhists need to be very, very careful about not getting involved with any of that stuff. That's a kind of hell that's brought to earth. Avalokiteshvara's vase of Amrita does have the meaning of the immediate soothing of suffering, but Amrita means the deathless, and it's referring to nirvana. It's referring to that which transcends birth and death, the wheel of life, that which is a real alternative to just going through these cyclic, habitual states of mind that we can descend into, which is a real alternative to meaninglessness. It's a state, the deathless is really, it's not a sort of heaven. It's a state of, if you like, of uninterrupted creativity in relation to other people, in relation to your life. There's a wonderful verse, the beginning of, I think, is it the third or the second chapter of the Dhammapada, very, very famous Buddhist collection. Mindfulness is the way to the deathless. Unmindfulness, the way to death. Those who are mindful do not die. Those who are unmindful are already dead. And of course, the mindfulness that the Buddha is talking about is not secular mindfulness. He's talking about what's called apramada. It's sort of wakefulness. It's a bright quality of awareness. It's a kind of vigilance. It's a kind of creative awareness. Very bright and luminous, transcending in the end self and other, and opening out into a vast and unfolding consciousness and compassionate activity, a real sort of liveliness, if you like, a real creativity. If you have that, you are deathless. Doesn't mean you won't die, your body will die, but something will not be defined by birth and death, by sickness, by the wheel of life. Won't be defined by that. It will transcend that. It will carry on in spite of all that, if you like. But if you don't have that, well, you're already dead. You might be apparently alive, but it won't be real life. It won't be the life of life. And one of the things that happens when you develop this kind of mindfulness, this deathless mindfulness, this amrita, you can start to seriously enter into the training of a bodhisattva and develop a completely new kind of consciousness, which is the great compassion. You can train in the great compassion. You can train to be like Avalokiteshvara himself. And one of the things it opens up is a much more profound awareness of the interconnection between self and others. There's a very, very famous 8th century Buddhist text called the Bodhicharyavatara, the entry into the way of a bodhisattva, the entry into the way of enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, by somebody called Shantideva. And Shantideva gives, in the meditation section of that book, he tells you what the perfection of meditation really is. You might be quite surprised to hear how he regards the perfection of meditation. It's not about blissing out. Well, it is about blissing out, but not just for yourself. It's about developing a consciousness that embraces everybody. And he gives very, very simple meditations. I'll just read you some verses from it, just give you a flavor in his words. I will renounce identifying with myself and will take as myself other people. One loves one's hands and limbs as members of the body. So why not love other living beings as members of the universe? So it's a lovely idea that all other people are all part of one vast body, not just all other people, all other beings. They're part of one body. So let's start identifying with that one body. By force of habit, one has come to imagine this body, which has no fixed and separate self, as a self. So why not practice seeing oneself as residing in others? Through acting like this for the good of others, there is neither intoxication nor dismay. Even after giving oneself as food to others, there arises no expectation of reward. What he's getting at here is that in this tradition, a bodhisattva is someone who lives a life of completely selfless service to others. And sometimes when you try to live a life of selfless service to others, when you're successful in that, you feel elated, intoxicated. When you fail, and especially, when they're ungrateful and they spurn you and reject you, as I can see mothers smiling here for something. You feel dismay, you feel fed up and resentful. He's saying, well, if you really identify with others, that doesn't happen. That really doesn't happen. You don't feel like that. You don't feel that because there isn't that sense of separation. Therefore, in the same way that one desires to protect oneself from affliction, grief, and the like, so an attitude of protectiveness and of compassion should be practiced towards the whole world. Those who have developed their stream of consciousness in this way, who delight in pacifying the sufferings of others, plunge down into the deepest hell as ruddy geese into a cluster of lotus blossoms. So in other words, he's saying that when you really meditate like this, you don't see hell as hell. You don't see extreme suffering in that way. You see it as an incredibly beautiful image, isn't it? You see it entirely differently. What you see is, or here is a place for liberation. And this person is not separate from me, not easy to achieve. But, perhaps when we do the Padmavajra tonight, you could bring something of that reflection into the meditation when you are developing loving kindness to the others in the meditation. Try to really identify with them. In the same way that you would protect your hand if it was painful. Try to think of the other person as it were, not exactly as an extension of yourself, because they are others, but try to foster the same attitude of protectiveness and care that you would to them as you would to yourself. In the end, we have to train to be like a Buddha. I said there are all these Buddha seeds in hell. There are all these potentialities for becoming a Buddha. And we need to sort of think in terms of living a life, yes, of service to alleviate the suffering around us. Some of you might remember, those of you who know me well, I lived for many years in India, where I was involved in our order there, and our order there comes from people who with backgrounds of tremendous suffering, because they come from Dalit communities and they became Buddhists as a way of liberation from the terrible oppression of caste and untouchability. And I've heard many life stories from very good friends in India, hearing about the oppressive conditions in which they lived, and how liberating the Dharma Buddhism was for them. And I've been to places in India, particularly when I lived in Bombay, with my Buddhist friends, my Indian Buddhist friends, going to some of the worst slums that you can come across in India. And it's incredible, communicating Buddhism to people in these very, very difficult conditions, teaching them meditation in very, very noisy Bombay, in very, very difficult circumstances, and this tremendous sort of sense of liberation that they were feeling through taking up Buddhist practice. It gave me enormous faith in the power of the Dharma to reach into states of suffering caused by tremendous social injustice, which we really have to embrace all over the world, not just in India. And while I was there, I discovered a wonderful poem by a Buddhist poet simply called The Buddha, a poet named Daya Pawar, who came from that Dalit, downtrodden background. And his vision of the Buddha is perhaps very different from our own vision of the Buddha in the West. It's not the Buddha sitting on the shrine. It's a different kind of Buddha, if you like. It's the Buddha who goes perhaps into the hells that we find in this world. So I'll conclude this talk with this poem by Daya Pawar, The Buddha. I never see you in Jeta's garden, sitting with your eyes closed, meditating in the lotus position, or in the Ajanta and Ellora caves with your stone lips sewn shut, sleeping the last sleep of your life. I only see you walking, talking, breathing gently, healingly, on the sorrows of the poor and the weak, going from hut to hut in the life-destroying darkness with a torch in your hand, giving their suffering, which drains their blood like a contagious disease, a whole new meaning. Thank you.